This was the Gaza Strip, a 25-mile stretch along the Mediterranean coast, home to just over 2 million people. Today, the once bustling streets and high-rise buildings have been reduced to rubble. But underneath the wreckage lies a vast, sophisticated web of tunnels, longer than London's underground. This extensive network is a key weapon in Hamas's arsenal, from which they smuggle weapons and people for their war against Israel. The tunnels began as a lifeline for families divided by impermeable borders. When Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007, they poured billions of dollars into this underground infrastructure, waiting for the day their enemy would meet them in this airless, subterranean battlefield. How did Gaza's tunnels go from a primitive supply network to the world's largest underground war zone? Our story starts in Rafah, a city in the south of Gaza with a tumultuous history. In a matter of decades, it changed hands 4 times, from the Ottomans to the British to the Egyptians to the Israelis. In 1979, things changed once again when Israel and Egypt signed a peace agreement. As part of the deal, Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula. The new border between Israel and Egypt split Rafah in half. One part returned to Egypt. The other remained under Israeli control. And in the middle, a massive, impenetrable wall.
Right now we are standing in the urban area of the town of Rafah. The immediate problem that the line, as you see it over there, should run across the city and cut the town into 2 parts between Israel and Egypt.
Suddenly, neighbors who had grown up side by side lived in different countries. Families separated, unable to visit one another. But Gaza's people weren't about to let a wall keep them from their loved ones. Armed with shovels and determination, they dug the first tunnels beneath Gaza, simple passageways carved out of sandy soil, connecting homes on either side of the border. These early tunnels were modest and easy to build, with openings hidden in basements. On one side, a family in Gaza. On the other, a family in Egypt. In between, a secret passageway that allowed them to visit. For a brief moment, the tunnel stood as a testament to the enduring power of human connection. But it didn't take long for bad actors to exploit this system. With the wall cutting off access to Egypt, Gaza faced severe shortages of everyday essentials. Seizing the moment, enterprising smugglers turned the tunnels into underground trade routes, moving car parts, gasoline, and cigarettes into Gaza, all with a hefty markup, of course. When supply is low and demand is high, profits soar. And while the smugglers were cashing in, they were also filling a critical gap, helping their neighbors get the supplies they so desperately needed. For many Gazans, these tunnels became a lifeline. One Palestinian poetically called them the lungs through which Gaza breathed, the only escape from the suffocating blockades that Egypt and Israel imposed. Egypt and Israel were well aware of the tunnels, but for a long time, the 2 countries just looked away. They weren't going to interfere with the smuggling of cigarettes or with the family reunions that the tunnels enabled. Everyone, from the people of Rafah to the governments on either side of its wall, understood that this underground network kept Gaza's economy and morale afloat. But everything changed with the First Intifada. In 1987, tensions between Israelis and Palestinians reached a boiling point. Palestinians, frustrated by decades under Israeli control, began protesting. But the grassroots movement escalated quickly. Protests turned to riots. Screams turned to stone throwing. Palestinians took up arms, and the clashes between the IDF and the Palestinian crowds soon turned deadly. Gaza was tightly controlled by its neighbors in Israel and Egypt, and still, weapons kept appearing in the streets as if by magic. The tunnels had become a pipeline for the war against Israel. Israeli authorities tried to destroy the tunnels where they could, but the network grew increasingly sophisticated, and no one in Gaza was going to give up their lifeline to the other side. In 1993, Israel signed a peace deal with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, creating a semi-autonomous Palestinian government for the first time. The Jewish state asked the newly created Palestinian Authority for help in locating and destroying the tunnels, an opportunity for the PA to demonstrate its commitment to peace by cracking down on weapons smuggling. But the PA failed, miserably. Through a toxic combination of incompetence, corruption, and complicity, the PA left the tunnels intact. And for the next decade, the tunnel network only expanded, snaking underneath more and more of Gaza. By the time the Second Intifada broke out in 2000, the tunnels had become a critical component of Gaza's underground war machine. Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Fatah smuggled weapons at unprecedented rates. Underneath the ground, weapons makers assembled the bombs that would detonate in Israeli cafes and buses and streets, claiming more than 1,000 Israeli lives. Israel cracked down hard, determined to stop the terror. And at the end of the Second Intifada, more than 5,000 people were dead. The military launched operations in Gaza to stem the flow of weapons, demolishing buildings suspected of concealing tunnel entrances. But these efforts often meant displacing civilians and destroying homes, drawing harsh international condemnation. Despite these efforts, the tunnel network endured. Smugglers kept profiting. Terror groups kept building weapons. The problem seemed insurmountable, so Israel tried a different approach. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in the hopes that granting Gazans self-rule would finally reduce tensions.
ההתנתקות הזאת תקדם אותנו בדרך השלום עם הפלסטינאים ושאר שכנינו.
But the move backfired, spectacularly. Without Israeli forces on the ground, Hamas and other groups expanded their tunnel operations unchecked. What had once been a covert network grew into an underground empire, a sprawling web of tunnels beneath Gaza streets, the most important weapon in the fight against Israel. And that fight was now Gaza's first priority. Because in 2006, Gazans voted for Hamas to lead them. Now, to be clear, these people weren't all terrorist supporters. In fact, exit polls showed that a shocking 40% of Hamas voters supported the peace process, and over a third thought that the best path forward was the two-state solution. They saw Hamas as an antidote to the spectacular corruption of the Palestinian Authority. But Hamas and its rival party, Fatah, were unable to share power. Their attempts at a unity government ended in a civil war. By 2007, there was only one ruler in Gaza, Hamas, and they had one goal: targeting Israel.
إسرائيل دولة لا مقام لها على أرضنا. إحنا الدولة لابد أن نزيلها.
كل الأراضي الفلسطينية يعني زوال إسرائيل؟
طبعا.
So they poured their considerable resources into expanding the tunnel network. Billions of dollars earmarked for aid went instead to building a fully equipped war machine, with tunnels carved from solid rock more than 20 stories underground. For many Gazans, the tunnels still served a practical purpose. Alongside weapons, they continued to deliver essential goods like food and medicine. But Israel and Egypt had imposed blockades to curb the flow of weapons and weapons-making materials. And the blockades meant the demand for smuggled goods skyrocketed. Smuggling was lucrative, particularly for those who controlled the operation. Known as snakeheads, these individuals invested heavily to build the tunnels and then rented them out to groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. In return, they earned a cut of every shipment. The profits were staggering. By 2010, snakeheads could rake in up to $200,000 a day. It was a fortune in a region plagued by poverty. But for the ones doing the digging, the story was starkly different. Thousands of Gazans had once worked in Israel, an economic lifeline for a region plagued by poverty and unemployment. But that lifeline soon dried up. Hamas had refused to give up on its goal of eliminating Israel, launching more and more attacks on Israeli cities. And so, Israel rescinded the work permits that had allowed Gazan men to feed their families. Without other options, Gazans turned to the back-breaking, dangerous work of digging tunnels. But the burden often fell on children, who were small and nimble enough to chisel away at the tight crevices in the bedrock dozens of feet under the ground. A veritable army of kids risked their lives every day just to bring home a few dollars.
اكذب عليك ولا بشتغل في الانفاق؟
تشتغل في الانفاق؟ طب ليش بتشتغل في الانفاق؟ ابوك ايش بيشتغل؟
ابوي قاعد عشان اجيب ضرائب.
طب هالشغل في الانفاق بوفر لك دخل انك تعيش انت واهلك.
For many children in Gaza, digging tunnels has been a grim rite of passage, but the work was deadly. Cave-ins, electrocution, and exposure to toxic gases were constant threats.
هذه يعني أي انفجار أي دب أي شيء راحت علينا.
By Hamas's own admission, at least 160 people had died digging tunnels by 2010. Yet, the practice continued. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that these children understood the dangers before they ever picked up a shovel.
قبل يومين مش تفجر نفق ومات في ولد ل 14 سنة عمره، في أظن كمان شاب تصاوب معه لما نوقع عليهم النفق.
But with no other options, the risk wasn't enough to stop them. For many, it was their only chance to put food on the table.
لا حب نجيب رزق مرات بخاف.
ايش الخوف؟
خوف تفحر قبرك في ايدك تحت.
The tunnels offer a devastating glimpse into Gaza's increasing desperation. For many, they provided essential income and supplies. But for Israel, the tunnels represented an existential threat. Eliminating them became a national security imperative. The Israeli government wasn't interested in cracking down on the smuggling of food, cigarettes, and other goods. It mostly cared about the terrifying prospect of the tunnels being used to launch attacks within Israeli borders. This wasn't just paranoia.
نحن الآن في أسفل الحدود الفاصلة ما بين الأراضي المحررة والأراضي المحتلة. في لقاءنا القادم إن شاء الله تعالى خلف آليات ومواقع العدو.
In 2006, Hamas fighters emerged from an underground tunnel and kidnapped an Israeli soldier named Gilad Shalit. For 5 years, they held him in a 2-room complex lined with explosives, 50 feet underground. So the Israelis built a 20-foot-high, 10-foot-deep border wall equipped with sonar sensors to detect underground activity. But Hamas adapted, digging tunnels deeper, sometimes hundreds of feet below the surface, rendering the wall ineffective. In 2014, the IDF destroyed over 30 tunnels in a major military campaign. And on the other side of Gaza's border, Egypt flooded the tunnels with seawater from the Mediterranean. But the problem persisted. For every tunnel Egypt and Israel destroyed, Hamas just built more, deeper, stronger, and more sophisticated. Israeli engineers developed high-tech detection systems and implemented a systematic process for locating and destroying tunnels. Dubbed the Steel Dome, this initiative aimed to neutralize the underground threat. In 2021, Israel announced significant progress, claiming to have destroyed 62 miles of tunnels. But Hamas was quick to counter, asserting that much of the 350-mile network remained intact.
بدوا يضحكوا على إنه 100 كيلو متر دمروا من أنفاق حماس. أنا أقول لكم أن ما لدينا من أنفاق في قطاع غزة يزيد على 500 كيلو متر. يعني لو صحت روايتهم فهم دمروا بس إيش 20%.
These are no longer the narrow, rudimentary tunnels of the 1980s. Today's tunnels are fortified with concrete and steel rebar designed to last. Some even resemble luxury living spaces, complete with tiled floors, air conditioning, plumbing, and ventilation systems. And they've grown in scale. Some wealthier Gazans have even used them to smuggle in luxury cars. This vast underground network is more than a military asset. It's an entire infrastructure hidden beneath Gaza's surface. Building hundreds of miles of deep, fortified, and well-equipped tunnels doesn't come cheap. Estimates suggest that constructing Gaza's underground cost nearly $1 billion. That's an extraordinary sum, especially in a region devastated by poverty. So, where did the money come from? Much of it was stolen from the very people Hamas claims to represent. Israel approved construction materials to enter Gaza for civilian projects, like rebuilding homes, roads, and schools. But instead of improving life on the surface, Hamas diverted these materials underground, redirecting them to expand their network of terror tunnels. The cost to Gaza civilians was staggering. Homes crumbled. Schools and hospitals were left unfinished. Communities in desperate need of support saw their resources vanish into the ground. Literally. When Israel discovered this blatant misuse of resources, they stopped sending construction materials, a logical step to protect their own security. Unfortunately, this also made life harder for ordinary Gazans, who were caught between Hamas's ambitions and the resulting restrictions.
يمكن سمعت مثلث برمودا انت صح؟ مثلث برمودا ايش هو؟ الداخل فيه مفقود مبينش. ونفسها غزة مثلث برمودا. حقت المواطن الغزي تمام اكثر مواطن عايش رفاهية في كل العالم. بحكم المساعدات اللي بتيجي وبحكم الدعم اللي بيجي. بس عندنا بغزة هون الفئة الحاكمة هي المسيطرة على كل الأوضاع.
Gazans lacked basic supplies, but they did have a sprawling, fully operational underground military base, complete with communication systems, storage facilities for weapons, training areas, and even weapons manufacturing sites. Hamas can move personnel, vehicles, and arms anywhere in Gaza without exposing themselves above ground. For over a year, they've been waging war from below the surface. But the most critical and dangerous function of the tunnels is their ability to shield Hamas from Israeli surveillance and airstrikes. The subterranean tunnel network presents a serious challenge to the Israeli Air Force. Many tunnels are buried so deep that surface attacks have no impact. The sandy soil, which made the tunnels easy to dig in the first place, now absorbs much of the force from the strikes. And then there's the simple but crucial advantage of concealment. No satellite, drone, or advanced technology can detect targets hidden beneath the layers of Earth. This isn't a side benefit of the tunnel system, it's a core feature. Hamas values the tunnels because they give them the ability to operate in complete secrecy, outmaneuvering even the most advanced military technology.
لأنه لا نملك ما ندفع به عن أنفسنا من القتل والاستهداف هذه الأنفاق من أجل أن نحمي أنفسنا من الطائرات، نحمي مقاتلين من الأنفاق.
Meanwhile, Hamas officials refuse to let ordinary Gazans shelter inside, leaving them exposed to Israeli airstrikes. Hamas leaders shelter beneath schools, hospitals, and homes, turning Gazan civilians into human shields. The international community is quick to blame Israel when civilians are caught in the crossfire.
Gross violations of the human rights of civilians.
We believe that war crimes are being committed there.
But they conveniently omit the fact that Hamas intentionally places its terror infrastructure directly beneath civilian populations for this very reason. Hamas has been explicit about its willingness to sacrifice civilians.
الشعوب يا أختي العزيزة لا تتحرر بسهولة. الروس قدموا 30 مليون ضحية في الحرب العالمية الثانية حتى يتحرروا من هجوم هتلر عليهم. الشعب الفيتنامي قدم 3 مليون ونصف بني آدم حتى هزموا الأمريكان. الشعب الفلسطيني مثل كل شعوب، ما في شعب يتحرر بدون تضحيات.
So Israel is left with only bad choices. Should they sacrifice young soldiers to the booby traps inside tunnels and homes? Or should they target Hamas's infrastructure with drones and bunker busters, knowing that civilians and Israeli hostages might be inside? When Israel has chosen the latter, it has been at a very high price for civilians. When Israel has chosen the former, it has been at a very high price for its soldiers. Meanwhile, Hamas exploits its remaining tunnels to move undetected and ambush IDF soldiers. This has dragged the conflict into a prolonged war, and that's part of Hamas's strategy. By forcing Israel into a drawn-out conflict in a civilian-heavy area, Hamas is betting on fierce international backlash. So far, it's working. Israeli citizens are fiercely critical of their government, while the rest of the world claims Israeli tactics are tantamount to genocide.
Madam Speaker, we are witnessing the Israeli government carry out a genocide in Gaza.
This war is unlike any the world has ever seen before. But the Israeli military is clear in its purpose. It's not waging a war against Palestinian civilians. It's not waging a war against Gaza. It's fighting Hamas, an internationally recognized terror organization that for years has treated its own people as cash cows and human shields. For everyone's sake, they must be defeated. Only then can the people of Gaza live the safe, dignified, prosperous life they deserve.